I was honored to receive Elizabeth Groppe's invitation to compose poetry for the 175th anniversary of foundation of our three women's congregations of Holy Cross. I want tonight to celebrate in poetic image the mission of this college and the land upon which it stands. All of us here, students, alumni, parents, teachers, and all who order this place into its singular beauty, we have built together a place in which we seek wisdom. We gather together to know her. The Book of Wisdom is the source text for these two poems. Both poems are in conversation with images from the St. John's Bible and the image of Our Lady, Seat of Wisdom, whose image is in each book in our library. I was a student here when Sister Madeleva was president, and it was for that reason that I wanted to write poems, particularly about wisdom. I will briefly describe the image that you will hear about in the first poem. When a scribe made an error in copying a manuscript, the scribe copied out the missing lines on the bottom or the side of a page. The calligrapher working on the Book of Wisdom of the St. John's Bible in Wales discovered that he had skipped two of the most crucial lines from chapter 7. I called, and the Spirit of Wisdom came to me. Following scribal practice, he copied the two lines on the bottom of the page. Following scribal practice, to have a little fun when you can, he then drew Leonardo da Vinci's pulley and attached the lines to the pulley. Then he drew a very furry bee. That furry bee's job was to haul the line up to its place by pulling on the pulley. Hauling wisdom into place, with or without a pulley, is the work of learning, our work. Analogy of the bee and the pulley. Just as the bee pulls the line, hind legs low, flying in free air, its back curved to lift the plank of missing words, I called, and the Spirit of Wisdom came to me. Just so, fierce knowing prints wisdom upon us, the center of our common gravity, and pulls us to her and holds us fast in cords, tenderly, heart root of grace. I called, and the Spirit of Wisdom came to me. Just so, the pulley, her formal courtesy and practical radiance, is made to draw us up to the mirror of wisdom, reflection of eternal light. She, whom we are able to take into our hands, mirror of moons, a ghostly beholding of grace, taught from within the mystery, heart root veiled. The image on the screen is the mirror of wisdom in the St. John's Bible, in the Book of Wisdom. The face of a wise old woman gazes out at us. Notice that her face taken from a photograph of a Palestinian woman, repeats itself several times on the left and in the center, and at least one time on the right. Our eyes must search for her faces in order to know her. The phases of the moon were taken from an Islamic astronomical chart. Wisdom here is the reflection of the divine light. She is also profoundly herself, the feminine face of the spirit. The poem I will read, Serenitas, begins and ends with a reference to the avenue of ancient sycamore trees here at the college. The poem acknowledges the strength of the women whom we all serve, coming from this college throughout the world, and also the dignity of women who struggle simply to survive. Serenitas. In the shadow of moon, we walk the sycamores. Women wrap their kneading bowls in cloaks of wool, flee homeland, weep brown tears, sew wedding jewels into the hems of their garments, pick spikelets of lavender, work olive oil into their hair against the heat, preserve the sound of desert's wails blowing, walk out past privacy of stone. Hold fast the mirror, she says. Test your stirrings, she says, thoroughly test your stirrings. Take care by the scruff of its weary neck, let it wrinkle your face like hers, give you direct gaze into within, so that soul melts into air, anima into aura, and serenitas. She says, hold on to word. Who knows my dwelling place? Who knows the reckoning of my moons? Grace is the within of God. Come and tell what its form may be. Come and tell. Come out, God in. Come out, God in. Come out, God in. Come out, God in. She carries remnants, daybreak and ripe fig, the smell of lemon, the baby's harness crossed over her shoulder, sun that hurts her eyes. She walks in bare feet towards the sea and the purple red of sundown, passes the girls' school closed after the violent season, waits for dark in her blue dress. She crosses into miles of nothing, spectral land from which the tide of sand goes out in quiet laps of red-brown. She walks on, kneels at the edge of the water, kisses the shore, place where his head was taken from his body. She walks into the tide, then out, then in, then out, then in, out and on into the shimmering, down-lit light. Her baby cries, a gentle shush, and she walks on. In shadow of moon, we walk the sycamores. In shadow of moon, we walk the sycamores.
It's now my distinct honor to introduce our 31st Madeleva Lecturer, Dr. Marianne Farina. Dr. Farina, a Sister of the Holy Cross, earned her master's in pastoral theology from Santa Clara University and her doctorate in theological ethics from Boston College in 2004. She's professor of philosophy and theology at Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, California, and is a member of its core doctoral faculty. She has been at GTU since 2005. Her areas of teaching and research include comparative theology, interfaith dialogue, philosophical studies in Islam, the Catholic Church's social justice teaching, and cross-cultural communication. She has published numerous articles over the years and chapters on these topics. Dr. Farina states the following about her teaching ideology, quote, "I want to inspire students to engage in the theological and philosophical study and discourse on the critical topics facing today's global communities. In my teaching, research, and pastoral ministry, I want to promote dialogue." Following Dr. Farina's lecture, Dr. Asma Afsaruddin will follow with a response. She is professor in the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Cultures at Indiana University in Bloomington. Her concentration is in the areas of religious and political thought of Islam, the study of primary Islamic texts, and then also gender. There will be an opportunity to ask questions to both speakers following her response. First, however, please join me in welcoming Dr. Marianne Farina as she presents her lecture, Sacred Conversations and the Evolution of Dialogue.
Thank you, Michelle. And I also want to voice a word of thanks to Professor Elizabeth Grope, who did much to organize this year's event for Madeleva. Elizabeth is the former director for the Center for Spirituality, and I want to wish a note of thanks for her. Thank you, President Mooney and your cabinet, especially Judy Fian, Vice President for Mission, Sister Veronique and the Sisters of the Holy Cross and your council, all the Sisters of the Holy Cross, students, friends, colleagues. It's wonderful to be here. I am honored to be asked to offer this 31st lecture dedicated to the pioneering vision of Sister Madeleva Wolf. I want to especially thank Eva and Asma, my esteemed colleagues, whose creativity and scholarship represent the epitome of Sister Madeleva's vision. As you have heard, this year's lecture coincides with the 175th founding of the three branches of the Sisters of the Holy Cross. It is a time for Holy Cross religious and associates, collaborators in Holy Cross ministries, and all with whom we share our life to remember the past with gratitude, live the present with passion, and embrace the future with hope. Striving always, we wish to communicate, as we say in Constitution number 3, that everything we are and do must communicate our commitment to God's desire for the transformation of human hearts and human relationships. In this Constitution, we also claim that, quote, recognizing our own powerlessness and need for God's love, we rely on the Spirit in opening ourselves to experience Christ's liberating salvation and with the people we serve, and that our awareness of sin and its consequences in the world obliges us to examine our own lives, to see to what depth we have assimilated the gospel message, end of quote. The following paragraph of our Constitution further states that we communicate God's desire for this transformation by building up a society of justice and love. Our model of faithfulness to this mission is Mary, Mother of Sorrows, who, full of compassion for the world, stood courageously at the foot of the cross, united with her Son in the work of salvation. Committed to be a compassionate presence in the world, the apostolic mission of the Sisters of the Holy Cross recognizes that God calls all creation to wholeness and fruitfulness. Sacred conversations are practices that help us realize this fulfillment. Much like Lectio Divina, with its various stages of prayerful movement toward the contemplation of God, sacred conversations brings us to appreciate the holiness in religions and cultures. These conversations promote mutual understanding and enrichment. They facilitate the passing over, as our Holy Cross brother John Donne described, from one's truth to another's truth and back to one's own. These journeys are transformative, bringing us to deeper knowledge about God, self, and others. Moreover, sacred conversations contribute to a deep theology, which, like deep ecology, contemplates the interconnectedness of all the cosmos. This deep theology evinces an evolutionary consciousness, skilled at holding in esteem the unfused, complex, and enthused connection that exists between all living beings and the goodness God has ordained for each. Sacred conversations as commitments to the commonwealth of life promote a commonwealth of understanding. Tonight, I wish to explore with you the meaning and practice of sacred conversations and the evolution of dialogue. I will also illustrate how the Holy Cross Apostolic Ministry is an example of this evolution. I hope to show that sacred conversations can foster a spirituality responsive to the needs of the 21st century. Sacred conversations. Sacred conversations are opportunities for holistic communication with God, our deepest self and others that God initiates. For as the sacred text of Christians and Muslims proclaim, God spoke and creation came into existence. These texts also tell of God's continual communication with creatures in ways that foster a deep interiority in our encounters with cultures and religions. As Dorothy Sole and Justo Gonçalves contend, these dialogues witness to God's work among us. Dialogues with religion thus can bring us into what Carl Jung regarded as the, quote, the spiritual adventure of our time, the exposure of human consciousness to the undefined and the indefinable, end of quote. In order to become cognizant of our common existence with others in this adventure, our sacred conversations help us to cross borders and return with new insights. These journeys are, as John Donne describes, passing over and coming back, experimenting with the truth of life and death. In passing over to our lives, one is led to turn the truth of one's own into poetry. This is especially clear when one comes to the point of saying to oneself, quote, "You are what human is, you are what God is." Still, the poetry here is not a falsification of the truth. It embodies rather deeper insights into that truth. Passing over to others' lives changes one's understanding of what is human and who God is. A story from experiences in Bangladesh illustrates this adventure. For 2 weeks in 1993, I joined the second team providing relief effort for the settlers of Shandip Island who experienced a devastating cyclone that killed approximately 230,000 people. During our relief efforts, we learned that Shandip was in the pathway for another serious storm. Little infrastructure remained from the last storm, and there was concern about the rush of water the island would have to bear. The organizations, such as Caritas and BROC, devised a plan to put as many people as possible into the remaining storm shelters and others into cement two-story buildings. Women and children slept on the second floor of these buildings, while the men occupied the first floor. The administrative teams of the relief organization chose to give their space to others. They slept in the tents and that had served as food distribution and clinic centers. As evening approached, we gathered into our designated areas. Sister Florence, my co-worker, and I took our place among the women, most of whom were Muslim. As we awaited the coming storm, all began to pray. The Muslim women with their children resting near them recited the Quran and made supplication, du'as, asking for God's mercy. Sister Florence and I prayed the rosary and meditated silently with them. After some hours, Florence and I decided to sleep, thinking that if we were to survive the storm, we would need to help with the relief work the next day. The Muslim women remained awake with recitation and prayer. Despite the great rain and the terrifying winds, the eye of the storm had taken a dramatic turn, and the island did not receive a direct hit. Most people survived, even those who had slept in the tents. Over a simple breakfast, we had a chance to share our experiences of that fearful night. I spoke with some Muslim women and asked if they had stayed awake in order to comfort their children. The women replied with great animation that indeed they were protecting their children, but that they remained in the prayer circle because if that night was to be their last, they wanted to meet God together as a community, uttering God's own words on their lips. At that moment, and in their telling, I gained insight into the meaning of the Muslim Ummah, the community of faith here and in the afterlife, the universal Ummah transformed. This experience brought into relief the many gospel accounts of Jesus calling his community to accompany him as he teaches and heals and feeds. These encounters are opportunities to stay awake with him, not only in the garden, but through a deeper realization that we form the deeper mystical body of Christ. United to Christ, we participate in the life after death that scholar N.T. Wright explains was the hope of the early Christian community. Before Shandip, I had worked with Muslim communities in Dhaka and Jalchatra for over 10 years. Together, we organized various educational and social justice projects, and these encounters taught me much about Islam. However, that breakfast conversation offered more. As a sacred exchange, it revealed to me the poetry of Islam and my own tradition. Creating this poetry, as John Donne illustrates, is an ancient and shared practice, dating back to when peoples of various cultures and religions engaged in efforts dedicated to the search for wisdom. Some of these exchanges were informal, taking place in the meeting of peoples through daily events and common settings. Others were the basis for decision-making that contributed to political and academic endeavors. For example, in the earliest universities in the Indian subcontinent, thousands of scholars and students from diverse backgrounds, China, Japan, Korea, and other countries, study the interconnections between sacred texts and other fields of study, philosophy, astrology, mathematics, languages, public health, and management. The history of these encounters contributes to epistemologies that shape our contemporary approaches, such as the philosophy of dialogue, and Christian and Muslim forms of dialogue of life, of study, spiritual experiences, and social projects. From these developments, however, I maintain that dialogues and exchanges are evolutionary when they become attentive to the movement of God's Spirit in them, even if the results may not produce the outcomes for which we hoped. The evolution of dialogue means entering into the depth of our shared existence in God. It is not a linear movement, but a profound discovery of God's presence in all that exists. Sacred conversations assist our entering into this depth, wherein we experience a spiritual power, that is, the love and compassion that Teilhard de Chardin claims is the future of all the earth. Thus, the evolution of dialogue and sacred conversations that brings us about transform our dialogues about spirituality to a spirituality of dialogue. And as Indian theologian Samuel Ryan notes, this pneumatology is the how and the horizon of liberative theology. It is seeing our dialogues as he proposes in the, quote, mission of the Spirit, quote, so that we come to greater realization that, quote, each particular reality is on mission to the rest in an intricate web of cosmic interdependence, and that religions, too, must be respectfully sought, offered, and received, assimilated, integrated, and lived for the benefit of the human family and its earth home, end of quote. Attentiveness to God's Spirit can expand our religious imaginations, so critical to awakening compassion. Moved by compassion, we courageously enter into various kinds of conversation, trusting that through these encounters we discover the endless generation of meaning that God unfolds before us. Professor Robert Schroeder emphasizes as well the importance of cultivating this contemplative attitude in what he calls boundary-crossing ministry, noting that it teaches us to learn to wait, to watch, and to listen. It is a work of the Spirit and a listening to the Spirit wisdom as she navigates us through the depths of our interconnecting, interdependent, holistic existence in God. As such, sacred conversations possess an existential dimension. Through them, as Thomas Merton notes, we go beyond the extrinsic information about religions, our world, and the cosmos to reach into the interior depth of a person's I am, to see that I am with others before God and all existence. Thus, these conversations can bring us to the threshold of epiphanies that, as Edith Stein claims, are the spiritual encounters of interconnectedness. Edith Stein writes, quote, because hidden souls do not live in isolation, but are part of the living nexus and have a position in the great divine order, we speak of an invisible church. Their impact and affinity can remain hidden from themselves and others for their entire earthly lives. But it is also possible for some of us to become visible in the external world. End of quote. Additionally, we recognize our role in these evolutionary movements. Punctuated with risk, but open to new possibilities, sacred conversations are connections similar to those identified by scientists developing deep ecology or systems theories. They note that principles like mutation and selection are superseded by cooperation. Evolutionary biologist Martin Nowak believes this third principle, cooperation, is the master architect of evolution. It is a principle of co-responsibility, co-responsiveness toward co-evolution. This is the willingness of species and subspecies to become what he calls super cooperators, who through features such as direct and indirect reciprocity become cognizant of paths that are a decision for growth, even to the point of self-sacrifice. Such cooperation relates to phenomenologist Jean-Luc Marin, who proposes that we think about donation as the driving force of our evolution. It is striking to see reality as something that shows itself, gives itself to us, and is revealed to us. It is in this gifting and giving there is an intersecting or interdependence of existence experienced between persons. Thus, through sacred conversations, significant friendships emerge and mature. These relationships create greater levels of connection, care, self-expression, and creativity. We realize that we share a common enterprise, as Teilhard explained, that is a zest for life, a zest for living in the dynamic processes of becoming, end of quote. Thus, sacred conversations are ultimate bridge builders, bridge building opportunities, because they generate deep learning. For the aim of dialogue and of all theological discourse, as David Tracy notes, is to learn how to become a learner. Sacred conversations can bring forth an evolutionary culture wherein our relationship to life, as Barbara Marx Hubbard notes, is not just about problems to be solved, but possibilities we must embrace, a repatterning of our institutions for cooperation and co-creativity. I believe this was the genius of John the 23rd and Paul the VI in two major encyclicals, Pacem in terris and Ecclesiam Suam. John the 23rd recommends in Pacem in terris to create international exchanges to foster interactive global responsibility. And Paul VI offers a model for interdependent, ecclesial, ecumenical, interreligious, and interideological dialogues as a basis for renewal of church and society. The effectiveness of their proposals relies more on a type of sacred conversation than diplomatic dialogue. They believe that as participants engage in these networks with frankness and transparency, they are becoming persons capable of a more just and collaborative leadership poised to address the global needs. Thus, sacred conversations are an essential feature of all types of dialogue. However, they are disciplines requiring the cultivation of virtue and the practice in sacred reading, Lectio Divina. Virtues form our thoughts and actions for discourse, and Lectio Divina provides a set of practices for dialogue as sacred conversations. Dialogue and virtue. Studies in the theology of religion identify approaches to other religions, sometimes as exclusive, inclusive, or pluralistic. This typology has become problematic, for no one category suffices to describe encounters between religious scholars or traditions. However, attempts to acknowledge our engagements do contribute to our understanding of God in this religiously diverse world, especially if, as Frank Clooney notes, we remain, quote, confident about the possibility of being intelligently faithful to tradition even while seeking fresh understanding from outside that tradition, end of quote. The deep learning across religious borders is the focus of the Catholic Church's teaching about the four forms of dialogue, of life, action, spirituality, and theological discourse. These dialogues are not attempts to domesticate the religious truth of others. They are, in fact, as theologian Stephen Bevins claims, prophetic dialogues, requiring an attitude of respect and openness that keeps the learning in the forefront. Specifically addressing this need for learning, Catherine Corneille's study, The Impossibility of Interreligious Dialogue, explains how certain virtues are vital to this task. She identifies 5: humility, commitment, interconnection, empathy, and hospitality. Tonight, I focus on 2. Humility. Humility in its spiritual and epistemic nature is essential to interreligious dialogue because it helps us to realize that we are situated beings. Using Bernard of Clairvaux's The 12 Steps of Humility and Pride, as well as other Christian and Buddhist sources, Corneille describes how 3 degrees of humility provide knowledge about oneself before God that can promote mutual learning among religions. Hospitality, she says, consists in a capacity to come to terms with the reality of fundamental differences in a tradition, teachings, and practices. Hospitality is an openness to difference that leads to a more profound self-knowledge, increased capacity for healthy self-criticism, and an integration of genuinely new religious insights and practices. This convergence respects what Desjardins scholar Frank de Cave identifies as the inner conversion of religions. Or as Bede Griffiths would say, quote, in each religion, you go deeper into it. You converge in its original source, end of quote. For me, humility and hospitality are the cornerstones for a spirituality of dialogue. Humility and hospitality underlie the Thomistic teaching about the need for onastas, honesty, integrity, truth, beauty in the moral and intellectual virtue. Honesty or integrity, along with right practical reason, grounds respectful studiousness that blocks pride, idolatry, making others into our own concepts of them, or curiosity about God, self, or the world, so that we may grow in our realization of God's love for us, ours for God, and for others. Similarly, in the Islamic tradition, Imam Abu Hamid al-Ghazali teaches that happiness consists in the right knowledge of self, God, this world, and the next. This knowledge animates a believer's remembrance of God and desire for their return to God. He stresses that humility about one's grasp of truth, while seeking greater openness to God's revelation, are conditions for purifying the heart and cultivating authentic faith and practice. Aquinas's and Al-Ghazali's teachings indicate how learning is an experience of liminality, growth and risk at the cutting edges, epistemic virtues that foster fluidity, flexibility, creativity, and courageous abandonment to the divine recklessness. Dialogue as Lectio Divina. Dialogue as Lectio Divina points to the meaning of the word dialogue. Dialogue, or the Greek dialogos, literally means through words. Through words, we exchange ideas, share ideals, promote understanding, and ultimately create new meaning. The process of Lectio Divina begins with reading God's word, lectio, engages God's word in meditation, meditatio, deepens in spiritual conversation with God, oratio, with a final step waiting for the unspoken word of God's presence, contemplatio. Adapting our dialogues to the Lectio Divina pattern transforms them into sacred conversations, for not simple dialogues of life, action, religious experience, or theological discourse. And this happens in several ways. First, this approach will help us improve our capacity for deep listening during our dialogues, especially as we become attentive to the motivations of the Spirit in the Lectio process. Secondly, we can see how sacred conversations to evaluate our dialogue sessions and common social justice activities will be helpful. For we will seek to discern God's Spirit in our conflicts and our struggles, and these may be the most profound revelations. Thirdly, Frank Clooney has noted how comparative theological study benefits from a type of reading modeled on the praxis of Lectio Divina. In this process, respect for the tradition accompanies the close reading of text. As a committed member of a faith tradition, readers deliberately seek guidance from the wisdom of the other tradition. Thus, comparative theology is a thoughtful reading of sacred text, not the consuming of religious writings. Moreover, as former Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams notes, these exchanges are opportunities to, quote, watch each other engaging in one's text. In this way, we enter into dialogues that are fundamentally oriented to getting to know one another's believing hearts. Through cultivating virtue and practicing Lectio Divina in dialogues, we become proficient in sacred conversations. These exchanges keep us on the path from our own tradition to another and back to our own, no matter the complexity or the difficulty. They are essential to a spirituality of dialogue that celebrates the interconnectedness of all creation and witnesses to God's desire for the transformation of all existence. It is a search for truth, and as Thomas Aquinas reminds us, quote, we must love them both, those whose opinions we share and those whose opinions we reject. For both have labored in the search for truth, and both have helped us in the finding it. End of quote. As such, then, a spirituality of dialogue can also inform academic pursuits. The Association of Theological Schools has revised the standard for multi-faith competencies through adapting a series of best practices fostering intellectual and spiritual hospitality. Additionally, the Graduate Theological Union has created a new doctoral program in which students in any given concentration will learn how to respectfully read across religious traditions and disciplines based on phenomenological and hermeneutical approaches. Whether we are engaged in dialogue or academic study, conversations focused on deep listening and the movements of the Spirit are critical to developing scholarship and pastoral research responsive to today's reality. One example of such efforts is the story of Holy Cross. Excuse me. My convictions about the importance of sacred conversations and their transformative potential emerge from theology, evolutionary science, and studies in interreligious dialogue. Furthermore, they are the fruit of reflection on the apostolic charism of Holy Cross and our collaborations with communities throughout the globe. Holy Cross Life and Ministry offers an example of the ways that sacred conversations and the relationships that arise out of them provide a powerful witness of hope especially in times of great conflict. Recently, in the San Francisco Bay Area, the story of these conversations was portrayed in an exhibit depicting various religious traditions. The exhibit was called Thresholds of Faith, 4 Entries into the Beyond, and was on view in the Manresa Gallery inside St. Ignatius Church on the campus of the University of San Francisco in California. 4 artists from different faith traditions, Buddhist, Christian, Jewish, and Muslim, created a work of art on their particular spiritualities. To illustrate the Christian tradition, artist Lynn Ann Kirby chose to portray the Sisters of the Holy Cross in Brazil. Entitling her art faith narrative, quote, "Truly Our Sisters," she offered stories of how the sisters promote justice in the Brazilian society by their compassionate, liberating presence to all. Additionally, she invited the viewers during the exhibit to dialogue with the sisters. There were 5 interactive via Skype sessions provided for the forums for all involved to exchange their ideas and their concerns about intercultural living. Lynn Kirby's art narrative represents well the apostolic spirituality of Holy Cross, priests, brothers, and sisters, who live and minister with people across borders of every sort. This is a quote from Father Moreau's secular letter, number 20, to cross borders of every sort. On 5 continents and for over 175 years, CSC has collaborated with others in education, healthcare, parish work, and other ministries. In these efforts, the congregation remains committed to a spiritual formation that is, as CSC historian Joe Galanza notes, quote, "influenced by and responsive to the richness and depth of cultures to which we live and minister," end of quote. The narrative of these endeavors begins with our founder, Blessed Basil Anthony Moreau, who, born near Le Mans, founded the Congregation of the Family of Holy Cross in the mid-1800s in post-revolutionary France. Holy Cross emerges from the French Revolution and the reign of terror that followed, not unlike our experiences today. Moreau learned from stories of his parish priests who were living contacts with the heroes of such persecution, the need for perseverance against destructive forces. Through his own training, Moreau realized that the education of youth was critical to the reconstruction of the society. Originally, it was Father Jacques de Jarrier who initiated this work by forming an association of teacher brothers in the 1820s. Blessed Moreau eventually accepted responsibilities for these men and found ways to enhance the ministry. By incorporating his group of auxiliary priests and the newly founded religious women into these endeavors, Blessed Moreau formed the Association of Holy Cross, priests, brothers, sisters, and lay associates. Blessed Moreau's plan for the association was to form its members into, quote, "becoming educators in the faith," based on a spirituality that could sustain this ministry. Scholastic pursuits accompanied spiritual formation in ways that promoted holistic learning, making education truly the art of arts. The Holy Cross education model integrates intellectual, spiritual, artistic, physical, and social instruction. In Basil Moreau's vision, quote, "the mind should not be cultivated at the expense of the heart," end of quote. In this pedagogy, teachers and students are collaborators. Though their roles differ, they share in a common task of ongoing learning and formation. It is a non-hierarchical model of education. It's truly educare, to bring forth the goodness that God intends. Thus, we see in Moreau's vision information at the service of formation for the sake of transformation. And this requires an attentiveness to the interior life and relationships, revealing the works of the Spirit. Blessed Moreau emphasized that the association had to model this pedagogy. He believed that persons with different backgrounds, talents, and temperaments could form one heart, a community of common interest sharing a single goal, transformation. Blessed Moreau maintained that a spirit of union and zeal for God's work as an association of Holy Cross would, as he says, quote, "learn how even the cross can be borne as gift," end of quote, when he devoted us to becoming a compassionate presence to one another. O crux ave spes unica. spirit of union. In circular letter number 14, the Magna Carta of Holy Cross, Father Moreau reflects on John 15, the vine and the branches. Moreau urges his community to recognize that with Christ we form one body and one spirit. United to Christ, the vine, we, the branches, bear fruit for a world by the hope we bring through our witness and service in various contexts. Believing this union was a visible imitation of the Holy Family, he consecrated the three branches of Holy Cross to the three hearts of the Holy Family: the auxiliary priest to the Sacred Heart of Jesus, Shepherd of souls, the brothers to the Heart of Joseph, their patron, and the sisters to the Immaculate Heart of Mary, pierced with a sword. In this way, prayer, community life, and apostolic ministry embodied a dialogue for life, a spirituality of dialogue with one another. For Blessed Moreau, therefore, living community was a type of border crossing, a moving from personal preferences and social distinctions, and even a certain comfort about one's particular gifts in order to, as he says in his sermon, assimilate the thoughts, judgments, desires, words, and actions of Jesus Christ. Through relationships, we tutor each other in cultivating virtues that expand our religious imaginations as we deepen our trust in God's plan, divine providence, especially in the difficult times. Thus, community life fostered a befriending of threshold living, inspired by God's gift of hope. The gift of zeal. According to Blessed Moreau, the principal quality of CSC apostolic ministry is zeal. Zeal for him means a hunger for the mission, a burning desire which one feels to make God known, loved, and served. It is, as Joel Gillilanza describes, a power that grace through which the convictions of our heart are translated into the actions of our hand and directed toward the love of others. Moreau believed that with God's gift of zeal, we become emboldened by the Spirit to witness God's mercy and compassion in creative ways. And it was through these encounters that Holy Cross saw education as a work of compassion. It is love for another, rooted in our understanding of personal limitedness and sin. Or as CSC candidate Catherine Magoba from Uganda reflected, quote, God loves us endlessly. We should therefore love boundlessly. Encounters with the cross are inseparable from this ministry of compassion. They are, as Blessed Moreau contended, the hallmark of the works of God, manifesting the limitedness and evolving nature of God's grace at work within us and through us. Elia de Leo speaks of this evolutionary perspective when she says, quote, the world is not God's, and God is not the world, yet God is unlimited depth of love. The center of all is love that overflows onto new life. God is not a supernatural being hovering over the earth, but a supra-personal whole, the Omega who exists in all and through all. End of quote. Thus, the Holy Cross Apostolic charism, based on a spirit of union and a gift of hope, embodies a spirituality of dialogue. As educators in the faith, we become learners of the Spirit's movements among us. Through this spirituality of dialogue, CSC fostered honest, imaginative, challenging, and evolutionary relationships across cultures and religions. It took root in East Bengal over 160 years ago, when Holy Cross shared life and ministry with Christian, Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist, Jain, and tribal communities in Bangladesh. This is a story to which I now turn. And I was teasing Professor Asma Afsaruddin. I said, when I get to this point in the lecture, Ami shab kichu Bangla bolbo. I will only speak in Bengali. But that won't be great help. She would be able to understand me, but only a few in the audience. The Apostolic Mission of Holy Cross in Bengal. In speaking about the missions, we cannot ignore our history of mission that suffered from constructivist, patriarchal, and imperialistic activities and structures. Karen McCarthy Brown suggests that though Christianity faced religious, cultural, political pluralism in its encounters across borders, it proved, she says, unequal to the task of developing a truly global worldview. As a corrective to Brown's opinion, there is a model of mission of which I'm speaking about earlier, the Prophetic Dialogue, which suggests a spirituality of enculturation that seeks to encounter other religions and cultures authentically. This dynamic Steve Bevins describes, is where outsiders of the culture let go. They let go of superiority, of power, and of illusions that we can even understand cultures completely. And the insiders of cultures must speak out, speak from their histories, their cultures, the wisdom of their traditions. The story of Holy Cross is such an effort. Striving to remain open to self-reflection, theological consideration, and spiritual growth, these communities consciously sought to grasp the meaning of differing cultures and religious realities. It was a co-creative endeavor, challenging the superior-inferior knowledge tropes so prevalent in missionary activities. In Bengal, CSC came to appreciate the sacred experience of global interconnectedness and interdependence. In 1851, Propaganda Fide, the Vatican congregation that oversees the church missionary work, asked Basil Moreau to assume responsibility for the church's mission in East Bengal. I see this history of CSC's response to this request as three significant periods: reception of the mission, unfolding of the mission, and the ongoing growth of the mission, the latter of which continues to today. Each phase has required a kind of border crossing, personal, national, cultural, socioeconomic, and religious. The first period, the reception of the mission. The first period begins with a little-known account of Blessed Moreau's meeting with Pius IX. Our founder's subsequent acceptance of the mission to send CSC to East Bengal was based on a mystical experience that took place during that meeting. In a letter to Bishop Linneborn, one of the first CSC bishops of East Bengal, he describes Pius IX's request for CSC, Holy Cross, as an experience of Christ speaking directly to him. He could not refuse. This experience, as Linneborn claims, was a source of hope during the difficult decades needed to establish the ministry in East Bengal. The initial group sailing in November 1852 was forced to turn back in December due to a storm. A second group of priests, brothers, and sisters, including some of the original group, had casualties. And finally, a group did reach Calcutta May of 1853. And they proceeded to East Bengal, Bangladesh, setting in Dhaka, Chittagong, and Noakhali by June of that year. From the beginning, the Holy Cross community encountered a complex and culturally rich society that never really believed in shaking off past traditions or the values of the various religious codes. We inherited not only this social history, but a complex church history, since other diocesan priests and religious congregations of men and women had served the Christian populations before. Rather than solely concentrating on institutions founded by these former groups, Father Voisin, the first CSC superior of East Bengal, urged the community to go out to all the villages. He insisted that they learn Bengali and counseled them to cultivate openness and humility to all the people, not just the Christians. Thus, equipped with language skills and proper attitude, Father Voisin initiated a lectio, a reading of culture and history and religion with the people of East Bengal. We read in the Sisters' Chronicles, the archives of this period, not only about their ministries, but also about cultural and religious experiences. As one account states, quote, "Life in this field afar teaches more effectively than the finest text. I am learning the true meaning of my faith." In this way, mutual endeavors integral to education bore faithful witness to the gospel. The second period I call the unfolding of the mission. In this period, the congregation persevered, sending successive generations of missionaries from France and North America. This perseverance bore fruit in various ways: the establishment of a local church, which included vocations to religious life and the evangelization of the tribal peoples, greater development of educational programs in the villages and cities, the creation of various initiatives, especially growth in women's and men's cooperatives that address the needs and concerns of everyday life in East Bengal. The community reflected deeply on the words that they were learning from this experience, from the Muslims, the Hindus, the Jains, the Buddhists. This meditation, this meditatio, led to a mutual consecration of CSC efforts in forming and being invited to form collaborative ventures. I believe such intersubjectivity was based on two critical convictions: Basil Moreau's belief that ministry flows from our understanding of communion of persons in which all can be learned and be enriched, and the Quranic teaching of Ta'aruf, that God created different nations and tribes so that they might seek one another's friendship and learn from one another's differences. Recognizing religious others as hermeneutic companions, the Holy Cross family institutions join in local and national efforts to promote education, healthcare, and social development. These ventures supported the reconstruction of countries after world wars, civil strife, and the 1971 War of Independence. Historically remarkable, however, is that at the heart of these developments are partner friendships, not just the construction of projects and services in themselves. Through these relationships, we deepened our knowledge of cultures and religions. Commitment to this relationship was tested, especially when struggles arose between religions and regional groups. Our shared commitments, our collaborations, supported a shared prayer. They were the shared prayer, the oratio, fostered an ever-deepening solidarity among faith communities. The efforts bore fruit when the distant one became an intimate friend, as Rabindranath Tagore aptly sings, "Countless are the persons you made me know. Shelter me in the countless homes. You turned a distant into an intimate, a friend, and the foreigner into a brother." The third period is the period that is present till today, the ongoing growth of the mission. This next phase represents what is present in Bangladesh. The collaborative ventures noted above offered opportunities for ongoing learning with our interfaith friends in Bangladesh. Reverence for God's presence among us helped us to deconstruct false images of ourselves and others while continually cultivating a deep listening that provided for more authentic understanding. With each new generation of endeavors, the conversations expanded in unimaginable ways. My own experience of living and working with Bangladeshis helped me to realize that our presence there is not only about being educators in the faith, but about our ways of learning and our friendships that make us stewards of the mystery, as St. Paul says. Thus, we experience more intimately the faith of the people of Bangladesh. Through these relationships, we ponder the mystery. As stewards of the mystery, we become disciples of a vision larger than ourselves. For in such relationships, we realize the goodness of all existence, the beauty of our interconnectedness with others. In Islam, the corollary understanding comes into view with the concept of taqwa. Translated as God consciousness, taqwa means to keep in view, as if you see God, or as the famous hadith says, and if you don't see God, know that God sees you. It is a closely related concept to ihsan and the doing of the beautiful. To ponder, to do the beautiful, requires epistemic steadfastness. Thus, our conversations promote right relationships as we remain open to the Spirit. It is a presence that calls us to do the beautiful and to be compassionate as a God is compassionate. Even today in Bangladesh, as a recent NCR report on Global Sisters describes, Holy Cross sisters deepen their commitment to empower women through education and promoting interfaith understanding. They enter into difficult dialogues capable of addressing oppression and injustice. The story of Holy Cross in Bengal is a model of the life and ministry of Holy Cross throughout the world. Sacred conversations and learning with people of all cultures and religions teaches us about God, self, and others. We become stewards of the mystery, ready to imagine a different future, especially in the midst of terrifying realities. It is a spirituality of dialogue that crosses borders of every sort in order to witness to God's desire for the transformation of human hearts and human relationships. Here at St. Mary's, we have many examples of, especially as we read the life and work of Sister Madeleva. In her book, Conversations with Cassandra, Madeleva invites women to study theology because, and I quote her, "The best person to explain the meaning of a great book to us is its author. And God has written the book of the world for us, has created the masterpiece of the world for us. The more we know and understand and love him in his being and in all his being and his activities, the more completely we enter into every aspect of the world and of its existence, end of quote. And she concludes this section in her book, quote, let us realize of what spirit we are. This is the age of the Holy Spirit, end of quote. These words of Madeleva epitomize her vision. Gail Mandel puts this in bold relief when she noted in her 1994 lecture that, quote, distinctions between sacred and secular held little meaning, end of quote. She saw truth and beauty everywhere. Through deep listening with colleagues, friends in the classroom, on travels, and Sunday evening dinners with women students, she remained open to the Spirit. As teacher, scholar, administrator, and poet, she was a steward of the mystery. This was echoed once again in Sister Eva's poetry, especially as we heard, I called, and the Spirit came to me. Just so, fiercing, knowing Prince, wisdom upon us, the center of our common gravity, and pulls us to her and holds us fast in cords, tenderly heart-rooted grace. I called, and the Spirit of wisdom came to me. Journeys across borders of every sort have helped us to realize the Spirit's presence among us, beckoning us to reimagine our common life and ministry. Currently, we see evidence of this in the new reading of the Holy Cross Constitution by our Holy Cross sisters throughout the world. Emerging from their lived realities, they speak of becoming mutual witnesses of God's desire for transformation, so that they can courageously embrace this world rather than fear it, see it as a problem, or even as a project. For as Hans Kung famously stated, there will be no peace without peace among religions. There will be no peace among religions without dialogue. I must add, Benedictine monk Timothy Wright's conviction that there will be no peace without prayer. What I mean is contemplation and openness of the presence of God without controlling it. Sacred conversations foster this type of spirituality. Through them, we stand in solidarity with all others, filled with hope, especially at the foot of the cross, bearing witness to a future, bearing witness to a future larger than ourselves. O crux ave, spes unica. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. That's a really tough act to follow, isn't it? But let me begin by saying that I'm truly delighted to have been invited to respond to the 31st Madeleva Lecture by Sister Marianne, who over the years has become a truly dear friend and colleague. I also want to recognize Michelle Egan for arranging all the logistics. I'm sure that was not an easy task. And thank you, President Carol Mooney, for your support for this occasion. And thanks to all of you for taking time out of your schedule to be here. And I'm actually delighted to see so many old friends and colleagues here. Marianne and I met almost immediately after I came to Notre Dame in 1996, and it's hard to believe that it was 20 years ago, and where I taught for 13 years before leaving for Indiana University. Our paths crossed quite often during those 13 years, especially at the Center for Women's Intercultural Leadership, the Center for Spirituality here at St. Mary's. And at Marianne's invitation, while I was still here in South Bend, I also joined the New Voices seminar for a couple of years. And I know that the seminar is being held tomorrow, and I regret not being able to join it. I remember how delightful they were. I was furthermore privileged to attend a number of Madeleva lectures at St. Mary's, of which I also have fond memories. So it's truly delightful to be back for this special occasion. I remember reading the Madeleva Manifesto for the first time, I noticed there were copies of that outside. I hope you had a chance to pick it up. It's truly inspirational. But I was particularly impressed by its fundamental, powerful message of what it terms gospel feminism. And it was immediately evocative for me of Quranic feminism, as increasingly practiced by many Muslim women, who similarly ground their empowerment in scripture and do not take their cue from man-made regulations that through the centuries have relegated women to the sidelines of their community. And it was good to be reminded from time to time at St. Mary's that theology is not the exclusive prerogative of men, and that highly intelligent, dedicated women of faith, many of whom are here, are making important differences in the quality and tenor of life everywhere, even if it mostly happens under the radar. And more often than not, it is happening under the radar. Happily, our paths, Marianne's and mine, have continued to cross through the years, even after my departure from South Bend, especially at various symposia focused on interfaith dialogue. Marianne's impassioned and moving essay expresses her own personal commitment to the sacred task of opening avenues of conversation and service between different faith communities, but particularly between Christians and Muslims, in the name of the one God we love and serve. As she herself states, her own dedication to interfaith dialogue is undergirded by the statement contained in clause number 3 in the CSC Constitution that, and I'm quoting now, everything we are and do must communicate our commitment to God's desire for the transformation of human hearts and human relationships. Here I am reminded of the Quran's emphasis on the transformation of human hearts as a prelude to a meaningful relationship with God and with one's fellow human beings. In one of its best known and much cited verse, the Quran in chapter 13, verse 11 states, "Indeed, God does not change people's circumstances unless they change what is in themselves." According to this verse, change is to be effected first internally in the individual before any meaningful external change can take root. And I think that kind of cuts to the gist of much of what you were saying today. The most important site for bringing about genuine individual change, followed by social change, is thus clearly the human heart. Transformation of the human heart occurs by making it receptive to God's will and becoming filled with God consciousness. In Arabic, this God consciousness is termed taqwa. I'm very glad you mentioned that. It makes my life a little easier. It's a very important concept. And it refers to the inner piety which transforms our relationship, not only with the Almighty, but also with our neighbors and all those we meet in the course of our lives. Both our faith traditions emphasize the importance of this principle of reconciliation with our Creator and His created beings, and both emphasize the necessity of this inner transformation that we must undergo for undertaking a life of service to others. When I taught courses on Islam at Notre Dame, I would explain the principle of taqwa to my students as being equivalent in the Christian milieu to being filled with the Holy Spirit. And at once they would get it. Being filled with taqwa or the Holy Spirit in each tradition is similarly understood to be fundamentally transformative of the human being, which endows even mundane actions with greater meaning and depth. Importantly, Marianne emphasizes that we communicate God's desire for this transformation in us by building up a society of justice and love. Too often, pious intent remains at the level of words only, and righteousness consists of not doing certain things rather than proactively doing things. A more positive, service-oriented notion of piety requires us to work towards a society that is full of compassion and justice towards particularly its disadvantaged members, and to cultivate an attitude of openness to the so-called other. That is to say, those who practice a religion different from ours, those who speak a different language, and who adhere to different cultural practices. The Quran refers to this as at-ta'aruf. Thank you, Marianne. And as she ably explained, it means to get to know one another and celebrate each other's differences, even as we seek commonly shared values. And in the Christian tradition, this would be equivalent to hospitality, which similarly emphasizes an openness to difference, borrowing your terminology, that leads to more profound self-knowledge. It is fitting that Marianne should end her inspirational talk by emphasizing hope, to which God calls us to bear witness. Both Christianity and Islam are founded on hope. The Quran and the Bible assure us that we must never despair of God's love and solicitude for us, and never lose faith in the ultimate goodness of human beings. The well-known Islamic concept of fitra underscores how humans are wired to be good and to carry out acts of goodness. When we fail to do so, we fail ourselves and others as human beings. We realize our fullest potential as human beings when we live up to this mandate to seek the best in ourselves and in others through love of God and in sincere servitude to Him. The common word statement that many of you may have already heard about emphasizes the bedrock tenet of both Islam and Christianity, love of God and neighbor. As many of you may already know, the common word statement invokes Quran 3:64, a verse that in recent times has received much attention in interfaith circles. This verse states, "Say, O people of the book," the people of the book is a reference to mainly Jews and Christians, "let us come to a common word between us and you, that we will worship only the one God, and not ascribe any partner to Him, nor should any of us take others as lords besides the one God." End of quote. In a recent study, I undertook a survey of some of the most prominent interpretations of this verse, and I found all the exegetes in my survey to be in agreement that the phrase common word, in Arabic kalimat sawa, is primarily a reference to a word of justice, which in itself is open to interpretation. Justice is thus variously interpreted as sincerity by one very early exegete, as upright and an assertion of the oneness of God by two well-known exegetes from between the 10th and 12th centuries, and as fair and equitable by yet another exegete from the 13th century. It is highly significant in that in 2007, this Quranic phrase, kalimat sawa, or common word, was invoked by 138 Muslim scholars and clerics in a statement addressed to Christian religious leaders of various denominations that became known as the Common Word Statement. Now, out of curiosity, I want to find out how many people in the audience has heard of this Common Word Statement. Just as I thought, just a sprinkling of hands. Isn't that interesting, right? Good news gets buried in the newspapers, whereas bad news regularly makes it to the front pages and to the banner headlines. It was a very important document. And what's interesting is that with interpretive creativity, the Muslim signatories to the Common Word Statement may be regarded as having distilled these various understandings of justice into the pithy commandment, love God and your neighbor. Such interpretive discernment in the context of dialogue that we heard so much about and so eloquently was clearly born of deep reflection on the whys and wherefores of interfaith encounters and existential necessity. In our fractious and fragile post-September 11 world, a common word must of necessity be a word that unites, that heals, and that creates common ground on the basis of shared beliefs and values. And I think this is an example of the deep theology and deep listening that Marianne spoke so eloquently about, and that leads to true wisdom. The last time Marianne and I met was at a Common Word follow-up conference held in Dublin, Ireland, at Mater Dei University in 2013. In fact, we were just conversing about that conference because it was such an important occasion. And happily, there is a publication forthcoming from the conference, so you will have a chance to read the wonderful papers that were presented there. The palpable goodwill and genuine meeting of minds between Christians and Muslims that was evident there is not uncommon at all. And this has been an express objective of the Common Word Declaration, and much good continues to come out of the activities that have been organized to attempt to fulfill its lofty goals. Again, a lot of these activities are going on below the radar, but they're there. And cumulatively, I'm very confident that they're bound to make a difference sooner or later. In our most perceptive talk today, Marianne shows us that we find this common ground through dialogue, what she calls sacred conversations. And I loved her emphasis on these sacred conversations, the practice of which, she affirms, undergirds the apostolic mission of the Sisters of the Holy Cross, which she so ably represents, and from whose ranks came Sister Madeleva, whose name we commemorate today. For dialogue to be fruitful, to be truly sacred, it must indeed be conducted in the proper spirit and with the respect it deserves. Marianne picks humility and hospitality as the two essential virtues that we must bring to the conversation table, for they are, she says, the cornerstones of a spirituality of dialogue. That's very well put. It's hard to top that. And such a perspective resonates strongly within the Islamic milieu as well. Small wonder then that Thomas Aquinas and Al-Ghazali, two intellectual giants in the pre-modern world, Christian and Muslim respectively, both acknowledge the importance of these virtues for proper knowledge of the self and its relationship to God. Today, we would add that these virtues are essential for conducting sacred conversations with one another that allow us to celebrate our interconnectedness and to remind us that we have a common responsibility to uphold and promote what is good and prevent what is wrong as part of our common stewardship of earth. Sacred conversations help to keep this compact among ourselves alive and relevant. And most importantly of all, these sacred conversations help us to push back against other profane conversations that seek to divide and foment hatred, of which, unfortunately, as we know, there has been way too much lately. Thank you very much.
Before we conclude this evening, I'd like to open it up. If anyone has questions, we have a couple students who have microphones. Questions for either Marianne or Asma. You've got one.
Good evening. My name is Bertie McElroy, and I just want to share with you that 12 years ago, Sister Marianne and Regina Weisert and Rahib from the Muslim community planted a seed in this community. And the seed was that Christian women and the Muslim women would come together in dialogue. We have been meeting for these 12 years, once a month, at the mosque and at a church. And about 3 or 4 years ago, we invited our Jewish sisters to join us. So, the beautiful presentation of sacred dialogue that was given tonight is very inspirational, but the practical application is here right now. And any one of you who wish to join this group is perfectly invited. Tuesday we meet at 12 o'clock at Little Flower Church. But through these 12 years, all I could think of was, when you were speaking, Marianne, is that your gift to the community is much greater than your scholarly gift, because we have flowered because of your interest in dialogue, and we thank you.
Well, if there's no more questions, I would ask that we continue to dialogue with cheese and fruit and sweets, and thank you again for coming this evening.